We ended up getting, I think, for my money, and I don't think I'm resigned to say this because I hopefully live a long life of movie going. I don't think I'll see a better studio picture in my lifetime. You have something that looks like nothing else ever made at this scale, and it nearly by a hair didn't happen. This is the Box Office Podcast. I'm Daniel Loria, the editorial director of Box Office Pro, the pulse of theatrical exhibition. And in this week's episode, I'll be talking to Russ Fischer, editorial director of the Box Office Studios, a division of our company that offers custom editorial content for movie theaters to engage with fans. We'll be talking about the opening of Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, or actually everything leading up to the opening of Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga next weekend. It's going to be our deep dive into the Mad Max franchise, going over the cultural, economic, and social impact of the Mad Max movies in anticipation of next weekend's release. But before we get there, I'm joined by my colleague Romeo Duchene from the Box Office Networks, and we will be going over the weekend forecast for this coming frame. We've got three new films opening in the market, but we're only expecting two of them to break into the top three. So let's get right into it. Romeo, great to see you again. You were in New Orleans not that long ago.
Yes, nice to see you again, Daniel. And I fell in love with this city. I fell in love with this city. Oh my God, that was just amazing. And I was lucky enough to see the Rolling Stone. And last weekend, I was at the Creative World Festival in Pasadena, see Blondie, Duran Duran, Placebo. I have the feeling in the past 2 weekends, I've been watching bands that are going probably to die in the next 5 years.
Don't say that about Blondie. Do not say that about Debbie Harry. She's my favorite. I love Blondie. Placebo, that's another great, man, I don't know if you remember the soundtrack from Cruel Intentions from late 90s. Placebo has a great song. Every Me, Every You, I think, opens that movie. One of my favorite opening pop soundtracks into late 90s MTV era teen movies. I have a soft spot for Cruel Intentions. Love that movie. And for Placebo, by the way. But let's not talk too much about music. We'll get lost here. We've got a lot of box office to cover. Let's start with this coming weekend, Romeo, because we've got a big bet in the marketplace. We've been talking about the potential of If, the upcoming live-action animation hybrid from director John Krasinski, starring Ryan Reynolds. Our colleague Russ Fischer has actually been calling this movie a live-action Pixar movie. That's very much what the marketing makes it feel like. But it's a big swing here. We don't really have good comparisons for this movie, and we've got an opening range at this point between $30 and $45 million for that domestic opening weekend. A big range because we really don't know where to situate this movie. We'll be knowing, I think, a lot more before our final forecast goes up online on boxofficepro.com this weekend. But we already know that the movie already opened in France and that it opened in third place, but there's actually two very hot titles in the marketplace right now.
Yes, in France, it opened on the 8th of May, so last Wednesday, and it was a holiday in France. So that was the box office was quite huge. And actually, yeah, it opened in the third place behind Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes and behind Un Petit Truc en Plus, which is one of the biggest opening for a French movie in France. So very happy to see that also.
So we have here in France a $3.3 million opening weekend from If. So third place finish behind Apes. That tells us maybe a little bit about the appeal of this title outside of family audiences. I'm not sure this is quite the four-quadrant everyone go to the movies event, at least not an opening weekend. We'll have to see what word of mouth tells us. It really is skewing towards more of a family title. So we've got two not perfect comps here for the domestic performance. What do you have in front of you, Romeo?
Well, obviously, I have Free Guy because now, as we know, Ryan Reynolds is a hot property. So that's why I wanted to bring Free Guy. And Free Guy in the US opened at $28 million. And then I have Pikachu. And Pikachu, yeah, it's an IP, so not very
Detective
comparable.
Pikachu. That's the 2019 Warner Brothers. So that's hybrid live action and animation. But I think we have to talk a little bit more about why these two comps are even being discussed here. I think Free Guy primarily because it's a original original movie. There's no IP behind it. That's very much the challenge that If has
Hmm.
ahead of it. So that's why it opened around 28.3 million in 2021. Adjusting that to where the market is today, we expect the low end of our range around the $30 million mark. That's probably the low end of our comps. And Pokemon Detective Pikachu that you mentioned, that's on the high end of our comps. That opened A, pre-pandemic, 2019. So it's a decreased marketplace now. And B, there's a massive IP behind Detective Pikachu
Yeah.
for that $54 million opening weekend. We're going to continue tracking ticket sales up until our final forecast comes out on Wednesday, and that will be available on boxofficepro.com.
And the French opening makes sense when you bring those two comparable because on the opening day, it opened like 42% less than Detective Pikachu, but opened way higher than Free Guy. And Free Guy at the time came out of nowhere, and I think it was like 2021 when the market was still recovering from the pandemic. So yeah, and in terms of international tracking trailer on our network, it will definitely open less than Pikachu for us and more than Free Guy. So again, I don't like to compare France and the US, but here it kind of makes sense.
Let's move on to the number 2 title we have forecasted here for this weekend. It's going to be the holdover frame for Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes from 20th Century Studios. Now, this title very much overperformed in the marketplace. Man, and did we need an overperformer in the marketplace? We've got Disney calling it a $58.5 million domestic debut for the Apes title, actually slightly overperforming its 2017 predecessor, War for the Planet of the Apes. Worldwide, it was a 131.2 million debut, adding up some of those overseas performers. So, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is really working very, very well on the market. We had a robust opening weekend, I think, in large part through those strong Sunday holds because of Mother's Day weekend here in the United States. Now, because of that, there's always a little bit of a hangover in the weekends following Mother's Day weekend, especially for holdovers. So we expect a slightly steeper drop than we'd usually give these titles. We are currently forecasting a second weekend for Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes between 22 and 28 million dollars. And that leads us to a third place finish for The Strangers, Chapter 1 from Lionsgate. Now, Romeo, you and I know that horror has been doing really, really well in the marketplace after the pandemic, but there's an asterisk this year with the genre. Nothing has really had the crossover success that we saw, let's say, from Megan at the start of
Mhm.
2023. So far this year, the highest opening weekend for a horror title is Night Swim. Back in January, that opened to 11.7 million. From there, we've had, I think, underwhelming opening weekends. Abigail, 10.2. Imaginary from Lionsgate, 9.9. 20th Century Studios had The First Omen at 8.3. And then most recently, we had the opening of Tarot from Sony at 6.5 million. So we have a depressed market right now for horror, and we're really expecting this movie to perform along those lines. A $7 to $12 million opening weekend range for Lionsgate's The Strangers Chapter 1. It's supposed to be the first part of a new prequel trilogy for this home invasion horror franchise. And that leads us into a wild card. Now, this title opening in only 2,000 screens, if it overperforms on a per screen average in that batch of theaters, this might sneak into third place, especially if Strangers underperforms. We've got from Focus Features Back to Black, the Amy Winehouse biopic. It's been doing great business overseas, particularly in markets like the UK, but we have a very low opening weekend range between 4 and 8 million, precisely because of that screen count we got last week confirmed from the studio. Only 2,000 locations for Back to Black. It is fighting for showtimes. It's going to be a competitive weekend in the marketplace. That's why we have it potentially sneaking in. And then its theatrical run after 2,000 locations, we've got that, 3-weekend theatrical exclusivity from Focus Universal titles if they don't hit a certain benchmark. I'm not sure this is going to be able to stay in the marketplace too long because of how it's being set up. But you have to wonder if this was always going to be a UK bet all along and just pick up what you can from the domestic market. And that wraps up our weekend forecast portion of this episode. And we do want to mention before we get into our lengthy conversation with Russ Fischer going over the history of the Mad Max movies at the box office, we're 2 weeks removed from this title, Romeo, Furiosa, a Mad
Hmm.
Max Saga. I've been texting everyone I know that's already seen it. Some great, great reactions so far. I think everybody's admitted, hey, listen, it's not Fury Road. It's not an exhilarating, breathless, 2 hour long chase sequence. There's an actual narrative structure here and multi act narrative going on in this movie, but it still delivers, I think, for fans. I think because of that, we are expecting a $40 to $55 million opening weekend range, 2 weeks removed from the debut of Furiosa Mad Max Saga. Now, that is a 3 day opening weekend range. We have to remember that those numbers are going to be inflated because of the Memorial Day weekend in the next frame coming up at the box office. It's competing with the Garfield movie at the box office. I think
Hmm.
that's going to be a little bit of a hit. And of course, you've got If appealing for female audiences, family audiences, and Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes performing so well. I think there is a slight concern that might steal some of its thunder.
It's pretty easy to find comps on that one compared to Eve, because we can definitely quote Mad Max Fury Road, or more recently, again, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. Mad Max Fury Road opened at $45 million in the US, the 154 cum domestic, and 400 million worldwide shy, like 380 millions. And Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, as you remind us, opened at 57, overperforming. So in terms of international tracking trailer on our side, it's definitely tracking less than Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, but not too far. So yeah, that's my take on that.
That's why we have that ceiling at 55 million right now before release. Of course, this can change significantly in the coming days and weeks, and we will be updating those forecasts every Wednesday on boxofficepro.com. But we did see the pre-sales period start last week, and we saw enough stability there to give us that confidence that this is going to be in that $40 to $55 million range. 40 being slightly below that $45 million opening weekend from Fury Road back in 2015, accounting for the differences in the marketplace. And then that 55 comparable to that 57, 58 that Apes overperformed with. I think that's a very good comp that we have here on both those ranges. We'll be continuing to look and track at those ticket sales in our pre-release tracking articles. We've got our Wednesday weekend previews and our Friday long-range forecast articles available over at boxofficepro.com. Well, Romeo, thank you so much for joining us in this forecasting segment. Coming up next for our listeners, we've got Russ Fischer joining me to go over the entire history of Mad Max at the box office. That's coming up after the break.
This episode of the Box Office Podcast is brought to you by Screenvision Media. Screenvision Media is a national leader in cinema advertising, boasting the most post-published showtime inventory and capturing nearly half of all cinema tickets sold nationwide. Their expansive network covers 94% of DMAs with almost 2,300 theaters and 14,000 screens. Screenvision Media reaches a young, diverse, and highly engaged audience with innovative ad solutions while guaranteeing incrementality and measurable business outcomes for advertisers. Choose Screenvision Media to leverage innovative ad solutions and guaranteed results in your cinema advertising campaigns.
And we are back here on the Box Office Podcast in this special look back on all of the Mad Max movies. I am here with my friend and colleague, Russ Fischer, the editorial director of the Box Office Studios, a division of our company that does custom content for movie theaters to better engage with movie fans. Russ, you are a long-time moviegoer, movie geek, movie fan, and movie journalist like myself. We're the perverts that are left in this decaying world. And that is the way I like to think of the Mad Max franchise as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. So thank you, question mark.
It's cinephiles, man. There's something wrong with us. But
There's
that's a
something
good
wrong
thing.
with us. Yeah,
We're
no
we're
question.
we're just still here alive somehow on the road, going from cinema to cinema. Regardless, what wonderful surprises from the world of studio mergers might come to us next. I know some doom and gloom there, but we'll see what happens.
Hey, just keep an eye out for me. I'm the guy with the goggles and the spikes.
That's how it feels like being a journalist in the movie world today. But let's dive right into it because these Mad Max movies, I missed out on them when I was a kid growing up. I was born in '85, which was the year when Mad Max Beyond
Thunderdome.
Thunderdome came out.
Yeah.
So I missed the entire sweep of these movies. But
Mm.
you were the right age, the perfect age. for
I
that
was the
first
perfect
trilogy.
age. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I didn't see the first movie when it was out. I was too young when Mad Max came out, and I didn't see Mad Max until probably high school. But when The Road Warrior came out, and yes, it is properly titled Mad Max 2 in Australia and in many other territories, but in the United States, it was called The Road Warrior because Mad Max had been released here and did well, but I think Warner Brothers was like, let's not play this off as a sequel. They called it The Road Warrior, which I think is a good idea. It's a great title. I was the perfect age for that movie. I think I was 9 when that came out, and it was like an instant playground legend, right? That movie,
Yeah.
that The Road Warrior was that movie that every kid talked about, and most of them hadn't seen it. I didn't see it for a couple of years after, but it was in the air. You knew what it was, and it was like, oh, have you seen The Road Warrior yet? And then when Thunderdome came out, that was the era when I was old enough to be riding my bike to the movie theater after school or on the weekends. I think I saw Thunderdome like 10 times in the
That makes
theater.
sense. That
I was
tracks.
so into that movie. I had the cassette soundtrack, I had the novelization. It's like I was fully into Thunderdome. And as such, I remain probably more affectionate towards that movie than I think you are, even though I think I can recognize its many, many problems. And then, obviously Fury Road comes out, and that became the movie that everybody saw, even if they didn't see it in theaters on opening weekend or at all. Certainly like a unique movie in the landscape.
Yeah, it's a sort of movie that everyone remembers when they saw it, where they saw it when it came out in 2015.
Oh,
the
yeah.
last entry in the franchise, Mad Max Fury Road. And of course, we're having this conversation right on the eve of release of Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga that is coming out to theaters next weekend. So we thought we'd give you guys a week to catch up and get excited for this movie. Man, I've already got my pre-sale tickets bought. I've got a Dolby Cinema auditorium locked in 3 p.m. Thursday.
Nice.
First screening I could find. I'm there on the third row. Again, just like a sick cinephile, just ready for that Atmos soundtrack to reign over me. I can't wait.
Perfect.
So let's dive into these movies because, as you said, Russ, they come out at a time when you're engaging with movies, when you're finding your taste in movies. I missed the boat. I actually first saw the original trilogy right before going to grad school. So I gave them a shot, and I really didn't know what I was going into. And then I think after watching them for the first time, one, I didn't like them, to be very, very honest. I didn't connect with them as a fan.
Mm-hmm.
But on an academic level, I can see why they were referenced in an academic setting.
Yeah.
There is just a lot of influences that are being pulled into these movies, all of them very distinct from one another, but have a, let's say, cohesive aesthetic strand in the production design, at least.
Oh, yeah.
Which just keeps on extending and expanding the mythology more than screenplays, more than character does. It's a weird sort of example where a franchise is built, I'd say 90% on stunt work and production design.
Yeah.
And I can't think of too many other examples like that. Maybe Alien to an extent.
To some extent, it's in there. And I guess, that's a big part of the DNA of Star Wars as well.
Yeah.
No question. Movies from the same era, right? Mad Max and Star Wars are very much contemporaries. And they developed very differently for obvious reasons. But yeah, I mean, I think that watching all these movies again, and I've seen them all several times each, and some of them I've seen many, many times. There are a few things that really stand out, but one of the most impressive things is that what Miller does aesthetically and like how he uses the camera, how he edits, is the stuff that he does in Mad Max in terms of car chases and stunt work is formally like almost indistinguishable from, indistinguishable is the wrong word, it's almost identical to the stuff he does in Fury Road. You know, like his command of character and the form and the shape of a movie is massively evolved by the time he gets to Fury Road. But when it comes to like how you put a camera near a car, how you photograph a chase and a crash and things like that, which, let's be honest, that's the stuff that made Mad Max what it was. He's got it. Like from moment one, he's got it. That stuff is down. And that's incredible. Like his instincts with respect to what he should be doing there were so precisely on point from the beginning. And it's been a process of refinement and like, how do you go bigger, and how do you create the same result but more safely, and you know, all that sort of thing. But it really is remarkable, like how Miller understood. Miller did not have your typical path to becoming a film director, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
he and his producing partner Byron Kennedy met while Miller was a resident doctor. He was an ER doctor for years. There's stories about him financing Mad Max by basically doing emergency doctor runs where Byron Kennedy would drive him around. He was like, Byron would do the driving and I would do the doctoring. And they would like take calls and go to people's houses and deal, you know, in the mid 70s, they did house calls. And he did that to finance Mad Max, which is wild. Like it's nuts. I love it. But, you know, he came from a perspective of, when he decided he wanted to do this, he really studied silent films, and he's been very open about the fact that he talks about Mad Max and he says, you know, I wanted to make a silent movie with sound.
Yeah.
And to him, there was a direct line from Buster Keaton and a movie like The General to what he's trying to do in Mad Max. He's been very open about that from day one. And then even if you look at Fury Road, like there are huge comparison points between stuff in a movie like Buster Keaton's The General and
right on through to Fury Road.
Right on to Fury Road. You know,
specifically when we talk about The General, I think the final 30 minutes, the last action set piece in Beyond Thunderdome, has a lot of that shared DNA. But let's open up this complex bottle of wine that is the Mad Max franchise, because there's a lot of influences here, right? We have to sort of let it open up, decant it, because if you look at what is directly in front of you, you can basically point out the cars, the DIY costume culture, right? The dystopic, post-apocalyptic. Yes, but there's so many influences here. You point out the silent era, specifically the very physical silent comedies. You bring up someone like Buster Keaton. There's just so much here that I also want to unravel and unwrap.
Absolutely.
I want to specifically go into a lot of the samurai films that Kurosawa made famous.
Yes.
You would call these sort of Jidaigeki films. There's a lot of that DNA in the background of Fury Road, and of all the Mad Max movies, to be honest, in the sense where you have this like roaming loner coming in, just saving a sort of village from, let's say, these rogue rebels. And there's maybe that loner isn't completely acting out of, let's say,
altruism.
Good intentions, altruism, right? Maybe it's a lot of self-interest built in, but ultimately the loner does the right thing. Obviously, a connection between that genre is the American Western, but I would say there's a lot more
and
Italian
the spaghetti Western.
I think there's a lot more spaghetti Western than American Western. If I go American Western, it would be post-spaghetti. So I would say there's a lot of Peck and Paw in here, not too much John Ford.
Well, I'll tell you, there is explicitly Peck and Paw in Mad Max, because the lenses or the lens that they used to shoot Mad Max was previously used by Sam Peckinpah on The Getaway. Because
makes total sense.
You know, you look at a movie like, okay, so let's talk about Mad Max first. You know, we'll get to Mel Gibson in a minute because he's a crucial part of it. But you're talking about an exploitation movie made in Australia at a time when there are a lot of exploitation movies starting to be made in Australia. You know, you hear about the Australian New Wave with directors like Peter Weir, movies like, you know, Picnic at Hanging Rock, The Last Wave, you know, a whole bunch of great movies. And at the same time, there was this wave of exploitation that was going on because Australia, as you see in the Mad Max movies, had a car culture, which means Australia had a drive-in movie culture,
and that's crucial.
Which is
You
crucial.
don't get an economy that can support genre film production without a place where they can make money, and that's where the drive-ins come in.
Right. And in other places, they might come in grindhouse theaters, like
Right.
in a large city. In Australia, that was the drive-ins. And a lot of countries that had thriving drive-in economies, but Australia did. So these exploitation movies became a big deal. They made a lot of money, and there was not a huge community making them, but there was a significant community with a bunch of key players, including people like the cinematographer John Seale, who ended up shooting Mad Max Fury Road. Like all of these people worked together or knew each other. Other people who were in that community included peripherally Nicole Kidman, who had some of her first bigger starring roles in productions that were produced by George Miller. The TV series Mini Vietnam, the movie Dead Calm, things like that. Miller made those movies. He produced them. So there was that community. And so into that, Miller comes and he's like, I want to make a movie. And he doesn't want to just make a movie. He wants to make a widescreen CinemaScope movie, which immediately makes Mad Max different from the other exploitation movies at the time, right?
Right.
Like those movies all are a little more conventional looking. And Miller's like, no, I want to do this widescreen. I want to put the camera like right on the road. I want to photograph car chases like they've never been photographed before.
Well, he wants to photograph car chases the way that William Wyler photographed the chariot sequence in Ben-Hur. That's another iconic action sequence that keeps on bringing up. We bring up that general action sequence with Buster Keaton literally on top of a train on those tracks. You also have to bring up that chariot race in Ben-Hur from William Wyler. There's a lot of those two movies that keeps on just showing up through this franchise.
Yeah, no question. So, they want to do this widescreen movie. They don't have a lot of CinemaScope lenses in Australia, and they get this set of lenses that Sam Peckinpah had used on The Getaway. And according to George Miller and to a couple of other people involved in the production, only one of those lenses actually was in good enough shape to work, because of course Peckinpah had done car chases with them and car crashes, and everybody's like, yeah, they were super banged up, so we used the 35 millimeter lens. And they say they shot all of Mad Max with that lens, which I'm not sure I actually believe, but it doesn't matter. It's a great story. And the point is, what you get a movie that is, yes, an exploitation movie, but it doesn't look like one, because it looks like a much bigger movie.
It's a movie that's resigned to be a product of its budget.
Yes.
It doesn't have the ambition to be a low-budget exploitation movie, but it has to play with the conventions. Yes. And if it has to play the conventions, why not elevate them just a little bit? So yes, there's a little bit too much nudity. There's hints of sexual violence. There's graphic violence galore. But you kind of feel that it's resigned to do that because it feels it has to, right? It has to just check some boxes in order to pick up distribution. But everything else, it seems to want to function as something bigger than what's intended to be.
There, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Miller and Kennedy had huge ambitions for Mad Max. And I don't think the movie, in some ways, I don't think the movie even comes close to fulfilling them.
I was about to say, I don't think it gets there. I would say I can see the ambition in the original Mad Max, the 1979 one. I would consider it a failure because I don't think it gets anywhere near what those ambitions are.
I mean, part of the problem is that, they find Mel Gibson. He's young. I think he's 21 when he does this movie. It's like, this is Mel Gibson's breakout movie, which is why he went back to the role multiple times. And obviously he, had affection for George Miller. Gibson is clearly like a star in the making in this movie. And Miller knows it, because it's 10 minutes into the movie before you even see Gibson's face. It's like he's shot like this, really almost like a mythical
it's
figure,
those Sergio Leone nonverbal establishing shots to tell you who the character is. And Leone does this wonderfully. I think in Once Upon a Time in the West, probably the best example of that, where you just, by little disembodied parts of your character, of your protagonist or antagonist, you're telling the audience who this guy is and why you should be paying attention to them. So there's no backstory here. There's no long conversation. There's no dialogue. It's established 100% visually through a succession of really insert shots, right?
Yes.
You kind of just like sneak in little glimpses of Mel Gibson in the opening 15 minutes of the film.
Yeah. But then the problem is, like, that first half of the movie, he's not in it very much. You know, it's like the 45 or 50-minute mark before it really becomes like Mel Gibson's movie. And there's a lot of stuff in that middle section of the movie where it's like, I don't know how much I care about this. And so it's got like a banger of an opening. There's some other good stuff interspersed in there, and it has a banger of an ending.
Yeah.
And those bookend sequences, plus Gibson and a handful of other elements, are enough to make Mad Max, you know, a huge success, regardless of whether or not it lives up to, you know, Miller and Kennedy's ambitions.
Yeah, definitely economically, it ends up being a success. It ends up getting picked up for distribution in the United States. It gets enough people having seen the film, having seen the potential not only of Gibson as a star, but Miller as a filmmaker. All those aspects that you talk about, the in between, the bookends of the original Mad Max, I think is what drags the film down. I think Mad Max is an example of a film that shows you the potential of a great filmmaker.
Yes.
But doesn't come close to realizing it. I think the pacing isn't where it's supposed to be. The editing is an editing of its era. There's a lot of TV conventions in terms of like very, very weird transitions and fade outs that don't work. The sound mix, I'm sorry, it benefits from the fact that you don't need dialogue to have this movie work at all. Again, to the point of this being a silent film made in a contemporary setting. But the sound mix is terrible. I think the score flattens the movie. I actually don't think any of the scores work up until Fury Road, and I think that's one of the reasons that Fury Road distinguishes itself so much from the original trilogy. But there's enough here that doesn't work to make you think, oh man, if they could only get another stab at it. I wonder what would happen if we go back here. You get the team back together, you give them a little bit more budget and see what happens. And that's exactly what happens in 1981 with the release of the sequel. At this point, Warner Brothers gets involved. And lo and behold, you go back to this world, you go back to this character, and you have a movie that's similar enough to the first one, but also different enough that you don't have to risk calling it Mad Max 2 in every market you release it in. It feels like a do-over. Before we started taping, I presented this to Russ. It feels a little bit like Evil Dead and Evil Dead Part 2, right? Where you just kind of get the chance to make a loose sequel, but try everything that worked the first time and ramp it back up again.
Absolutely. I mean, well, the other thing you talk about, like the editing in Mad Max, in some aspects of it feeling very TV. And there's a good reason for that, which is that it was a TV crew.
Yeah,
you know,
it feels that way. Yeah,
the crew that made the movie was mostly based in TV. They did not like George Miller because George Miller didn't know what he was doing. You know, I don't think it's hard to parse it out reading some of the stuff that's out there and going through interviews, but it seems like for a while he didn't even have an AD, being the assistant director, who most of you know what that is, but for anyone who doesn't, the assistant director is the person who A, makes the schedule, and B, is the person who really acts as the chief liaison between the director and the crew, and kind of lets the crew know what they're going to be doing so they can, you know, people can be prepping stuff beforehand. And it's like they're the person who makes the trains run on time, right? The AD. And the sense that I get is that they didn't have one for a while on this movie. And Miller quit Mad Max. He was so frustrated, he quit. And Byron Kennedy called up one of the other big exploitation directors in Australia, the guy who did Stunt Rock and a couple of other movies. And supposedly his advice was get a good AD. For George Miller. And they did that, and Miller came back and they finished the movie. But like by all accounts, the crew didn't like and didn't trust George Miller. And so there's stuff in there where it's like, you know, what would this look like if Miller knew what he was doing and had a crew that understood from the beginning what they were trying to do? And here it is, The Road Warrior. you know?
1982, and this is where we're going to really go into the films or the franchises economic impact in the US market, at least, because obviously the first one coming in from its roots as an Australian exploitation flick, it finds distribution, it picks up drive-ins, it picks up, I think, enough attention, but it isn't wholly well received. Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, gets released in the United States in a crowded summer market. Really, like, it's May when it comes out. So at this point, May isn't the summer movie season, but it very much leads into a summer where you have hits like E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, even comedies like Porky's that end up being huge blockbuster hits. Star Trek 2 comes out that year, Poltergeist. I mean, there's so many different movies. Even something like First Blood comes out in 1982. 82 ends up being an extremely competitive year for movies to stand out.
Yeah.
And Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, I don't think was initially seen as a movie that could really break out significantly in this marketplace, but it actually is able, through its own merits, to find a nice little niche for itself. It opens right on the second weekend of Conan the Barbarian, and actually opens in fourth place that weekend, but eventually finishes its run as one of the, I believe, the top 50 grossing films of the year. So it's not an overwhelming success in a year full of overwhelming successes, but it's still able to grab a part of the audience's attention.
Some of that, like, earning its success is certainly due to the increased profile of Mel Gibson, who was an unknown when Mad Max came out. And just a couple of years later, he doesn't have, like, he hasn't had time to create a huge, catalog of new titles. But he was in Gallipoli in 1981, Australian war movie by another Australian director we've already mentioned, Peter Weir. A really good movie that did well and, played outside Australia to good notes and all that sort of thing. So when The Road Warrior shows up, people know who Gibson is, to some extent at least. So that helps.
Well, it's also able to build on that Mel Gibson budding star power by putting him in a starring role that stands in stark contrast of other stars of that time. Let's
Yes.
remember that the very next weekend to this movie coming out in North America, Rocky 3 comes out. I mentioned it opens behind the second weekend of Conan the Barbarian. And it's the villain that looks like the action heroes of 1982. So it's an interesting inverse here. And I think it distinguishes that Mel Gibson star persona early on, where he doesn't have to follow the action hero mold that Schwarzenegger and Stallone are competing on, that you see other action heroes try to, emulate in that decade. He doesn't have to go down that road. And I think Mad Max is able to position him in that genre without putting him in a lot of the movies that didn't work for either Stallone or Schwarzenegger.
Well, and there's also the fact that, like, we've talked about the Japanese and then the Leone influence, which in some ways are the same influence on the original Mad Max. And the Road Warrior just pushes that even deeper, right? I mean, he is even more a man with no name character. But then there's the fact that Mel Gibson is a very different actor from Clint Eastwood, and he presents those moments and those story beats very differently, which make them feel whole and make them feel unique, which is great. There's also the fact that in Mad Max, it's like when it comes to the Max character before he's mad, he's not very interesting. He's just not. I wish it were different.
That drags down the film. The first Mad Max is dragged down by the character development scenes, by the dramatic love story. By the way, we're going to spoil the first Mad Max. In the last 20 minutes of the film, they kill off Mad Max's wife and kid off screen, and it turns the Mad Max character into this, like, desensitized loner that will end up being the character for the rest of the run. And it's a really interesting decision, I think, that Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, takes in its exposition. It doesn't really want to set up Max as the character it tries to turn him into in the first movie. In maybe a minute and a half worth of voiceover, it very quickly tells you, hey, the world's been destroyed. We're in a post-apocalyptic society where it's hard to get gasoline and natural resources. And there's this mythical hero guy that used to have a wife and kid that roams the earth. That's it. That's the introduction. That's all you need to know. You don't need to watch the last movie. That's all you need to know moving forward. And that's something that George Miller keeps on stressing on for all of the different films here. You can watch them out of order, you can watch them out of sequence, and the franchise still works.
I mean, one of my favorite things about this series, especially in contrast to franchise films of today, is that the continuity is loose at the very best. And I love that. He doesn't really care. I love that the storyline, in as much as you want to try to put it together, you kind of can't because the movies contradict each other a little bit, and it's fine. Who cares?
Yeah.
It's like supposed to be kind of legendary stuff anyway. So
I think that's a big part
sense.
of why George Miller comes back to make sequels. I think he gets a lot more interested in the Joseph Campbell hero journey, where there's a mythological character that can work across cultures, across different countries, across different storytelling traditions, so that it's like instantly recognizable regardless of where you are. And that's why it's interesting that these films are a success, but they haven't been a massive global box office behemoth. They've all been decent performers in the market that are beloved by audiences, but they really haven't been the sort of global appeal that you would assume movies that have very little dialogue and a universal global appeal would have.
I mean, Miller, again, talking about these things, he's explicitly said, like with Mad Max and then going forward into additional movies, he was like, I wanted to make a movie that, as Hitchcock would have said, if it plays in Japan, they don't have to read the subtitles, which is exactly what you were just saying.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that these movies are not immediate first weekend successes. They're weird movies. They break with what people have been conditioned to expect out of a certain type of movie like this. They have no interest. Miller has no interest in doing that stuff. And I think audiences respond to that eventually, which is why we're still talking about them. These movies, I think, do become very popular and they stick. Like, people like them and they keep going back to them. They just don't necessarily always see them. Like, the audience that you need to make $100 million first weekend hit is not the audience that necessarily likes these movies. And that's just the way it is. You can't change it. But that doesn't mean there isn't a huge audience for these films.
In 82, I mean, I think what I like about The Road Warrior the most is how it doesn't look like any other major studio movie of that time.
No,
and that's something that we're going to keep on saying, with the exception of 85's Thunderdome. I think that feels like the only studio movie of the bunch. This one feels like a studio budget being applied to an exploitation flick. And certainly you can see that in that last half hour, which might be maybe the best third act in 1980s studio filmmaking. And that's a big thing to say, because you have Aliens in there, you have The Thing in there, you've got Back to the Future. There's a lot of great third acts in 1980s studio filmmaking there, but Mad Max 2: The Road Warrior, I think, pulls off that last 30 minutes perfectly. In the lead up to the production of Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome the film gets released in 1985, but in the lead up, tragically, there's a key death in the production team here that I think impacts what we end up seeing on screen.
Yeah, so Byron Kennedy, Miller's best friend, his producing partner since day one. He's called him his brother. Byron Kennedy is killed while piloting a helicopter in 1983. It is obviously a shocking moment in George Miller's life and career. At the time, they had just finished kind of their first big TV miniseries, which ultimately did very well in Australia and helped kind of like forge some of how Miller approached some of this stuff going forward. It's called The Dismissal. But Kennedy is killed, and there's a while where I think George Miller doesn't even know if he wants to keep doing stuff. And yeah, I don't know. Do you want to recap? I think the wonderful thing about Road Warrior is you don't have to recap it. Like, Road Warrior is so evident what that movie is. Thunderdome, you kind of do, because Thunderdome feels like 2 or 3 movies sandwiched into one.
It's 2 movies. It feels like 2 long TV episodes.
Yes.
kind of edited together for a straight to video movie. I hate to say it, but I think it is, as much as I dislike the first Mad Max because of what it is through its nature. I mean, it's a exploitation movie from the 1970s that doesn't want to be an exploitation movie from the
Right.
1970s. In
Right.
itself, it's hard to get fully behind a movie like that. Thunderdome knows what it is. It is the third part in a trilogy from a major Hollywood studio with a growing Hollywood star in Mel Gibson. And it plays out like, I'm going to be very harsh in my assessment here, it plays out like a cheap sellout. It seems like there is a lot of interference here with the story. You mentioned that it's two films kind of oddly thrown in one. There's the first half of the movie where Tina Turner is cast as this antagonist. Anti-entity is her character name.
I love that
great name. The first half of the movie feels like we're in those like seedy cantinas in the first Star Wars.
Yeah.
What's that? What's the cantina called?
Mos Eisley. Well, Mos Eisley is the town. Yeah.
That's what the entire first half feels like. It feels like a little bit too derivative from Star Wars in that first half. And then in the second half, where you're in some sort of like weird paradise setting with children, there's a lot of Return of the Jedi Ewok BS in there that doesn't work at all here. There's a whole gang of children that gets paraded into the third act where you have a genre flick that is not afraid to kill off a baby in your first climax of your first movie, where in the third act, you kind of have to excuse there being a bunch of children there. The movie doesn't work for me at all. And there's a lot of products of the culture that get thrown in there that don't really seem like they work. The movie's called Beyond Thunderdome, but you cash in the Thunderdome in the first half hour. So the real climax of the movie, you spend 30 minutes in what feels like a WWF match, which was huge in 1985, that honestly, it just doesn't work at all here for me, Russ.
So a couple of things. Number one, I think the Thunderdome sequence itself works very well. I love that sequence. I think it's great.
Yeah, that's fair. But I'm going to defend that sequence. I'm going to criticize the fact that you cash it in 30 minutes in, man.
So early.
After that, you have nowhere to go.
And that's the problem with this movie, right? Is that it's like you set up this literal big bad, Master Blaster, a duo of an aged dwarf riding a giant guy's shoulders and them becoming these power brokers in Bartertown. The problem with Thunderdome is you create this literal big bad, and then 30 minutes in, he's done. And Tina Turner's character, because of her conflict with Master Blaster, she seems kind of neutered by the middle of the movie as well. And so you go through this whole, like, there's 40 minutes in the middle of this movie where you're like, what's the conflict here exactly? You know?
Yeah.
And there kind of isn't one because, like you say, Max is sent out of Bartertown on the back of a donkey wearing a bizarre paper mache mask, which I think is a lovely little visual detail.
There's like some Hodorowski zaniness to that where I felt like, okay, where does this movie go after you cash in the Thunderdome?
Totally.
I don't know, man. I can't wait to see where this Mad Max ends up from this donkey, but come on.
Yeah. So he ends up in this paradise grotto full of children who like
all have perfect teeth. They all look like child models, by the way. Like they're going to be in some sort of like Baby Gap catalog. It did not work.
You know what? You know what I'm going to say about that is we're in a post-apocalyptic future. There are no refined sugar products.
There you go. Good point. Parenting hack over there.
That's right. Exactly. All you got to do to keep your kids' teeth healthy is either brush them twice a day or, live in decades after the downfall of society. It's your choice. But, and Max, rightly, the kids, like, they want to go because they're trying to find their own mythical figure who at first they think is Max. And then he's like, no, I'm not that guy. And they want to leave and go try to find him. And Max is like, no, this place rules. We're staying here, you idiots. And then the kids leave. Some of the kids leave anyway. And suddenly the guy who doesn't really have a conscience develops, again, a conscience, which I think is one of the movie's biggest problems is like it relies on the self-evident fact that any normal person would go try to save children, which is true. It's true, yes, but like that's been the interesting thing about the Max character is maybe it's not true for him,
Yeah.
And suddenly he's like his character changes in the movie a little bit and changes good. It's necessary. But yeah, I agree. And then you get to this back half with the rematch with Bartertown, the rematch with Tina Turner's character. There's a great chase sequence in there, that train
Involving
sequence
a
you're talking
train.
about.
Yeah. That works really well, but you have all these children dragging it down, man. I mean, I get it. You want to use the Plato's cave allegory somewhere in
Yeah.
your mythical
Yeah.
storytelling. I get it.
Yeah.
You just don't hit us over the head with it so much. Leave the
Yeah.
kids behind.
Yeah.
Put your hero in a position where there's some peril. Because at least at the end of the first Mad Max, when you kill off a baby in your climactic scene, I don't know where this movie's going to go after that.
Right.
They just killed a baby.
Yeah,
in the
anything
third
could
act.
happen now.
Anything can happen.
What
But
are
in
you gonna
this
do?
one, by this point, it feels like they're trying to sell toys. That's what Thunderdome felt like to me.
This is a big Warner Brothers summer movie. They're not going to kill any of these kids. You know that. We're no longer making Australian exploitation movies. This is something different. Notably, this comes, a year after Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which is, to me, you mentioned Return of the Jedi, which I think is very accurate in the Ewokness of the kids. The back half of Thunderdome, there's a whole section of Thunderdome that to me feels like the mines section in Temple of Doom. Even the music feels kind of like Temple of Doom knockoff E, which is whatever. It's fine. But yeah, this movie it has a bunch of good stuff. Also, we got to talk about the Tina Turner thing.
Yes, because that does not work for me at all here.
The kid in me who still remembers seeing this movie is like, I don't know, she kind of makes it work. And watching it as an adult, it's like, nah, she really doesn't. And you have to take into account, like, Tina Turner was a gigantic star when this movie came out. Like, her record Private Dancer had come out the year before. Private Dancer was a massive career reinvention for Tina Turner. It was not her first solo record, but it was the solo record that completely remapped her career. Multiple huge hits off of that record. I'm not going to say nobody in music had more power than Tina Turner in late 84, early 85, but not many people in music had the power that Tina Turner had.
I mean, she was holding her own, or was even beyond artists like Prince, artists like Madonna,
Prince
artists like
wasn't
Michael
even
Jackson.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about these
Michael
iconic artists
Jackson
today.
is the only one who was probably
A little ahead,
bigger.
but I mean, Tina Turner was mentioned in the same sentence. I mean, that's how big of a star she was.
Rightly so. But the thing is, so I can see why you're like, let's put her in this movie.
Yeah, but do you open the movie with one of her pop songs? Come on, man. Post-apocalyptic Australia, and you open with a black screen with white credits and a pop song. It turned me off from second one. It felt like a product. It didn't feel like a movie.
Yeah,
and that's my overall criticism of Thunderdome.
And in many, many ways, I cannot disagree with you. Like I said earlier, I share George Miller's outlook, where George Miller said he's more affectionate. He's like, I have great affection for that movie, and in ways it's kind of my favorite, but he's like, I don't think anybody shares that opinion, and I understand why. One of the great things about George Miller is I don't think he has any illusions about the stuff that does and doesn't work in his movies. I think he's very aware of what doesn't work in Thunderdome, which is a lot of it. And you're right, it doesn't. I still like it, but I'm not going to be out here trying to convince you it's a great movie, because it's not. It's got a huge number of problems. And I do wonder how many of those problems would have been avoided by simply casting somebody else in the Tina Turner role. Because with someone of the star caliber of Tina Turner, you also get a level of control and a level of like, these movies are about like, we're going to go out in the desert and we're going to be dirty and disgusting for 3 months. And I don't think Tina Turner was necessarily doing that. You cast somebody else in that role, And it's not just can they perform the role better than she can, which there are a lot of people, unfortunately, who could have, but does it come with less backstage baggage that changes the production of the movie?
And you have to wonder if Kennedy was involved in the production of this film, George Miller's production partner for the prior two films.
How different?
How much of that studio interference or of that pushing certain concepts or ideas into this film get stopped on the tracks, right? But ultimately, audiences respond to this one. At the time, Russ, this ends up being one of the 20 highest grossing films of 1985. Another killer year, a year where you've got Back to the Future. By the way, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome opens the weekend after Back to the Future and naturally opens in second place to Back to the Future, never gets to the top of the box office. They just have this terrible luck of either having E.T. directly ahead of them in The Road Warrior, or in this case, coming right on the heels of Back to the Future. Doesn't really give them an opportunity to really explode into the marketplace.
I don't know how many people knew how big Back to the Future was going to be, you know?
Yeah, it was. That's another troubled production that, you know, just gets out the theaters by the skin of its teeth. Recastings, rewrites, and then just completely overperforms. That year, you also have Beverly Hills Cop, second highest grossing film of 1985. The first sequel to First Blood, Rambo, First Blood Part 2, Rocky 4. You got Cocoon in there, The Goonies. I mean, it's a killer year that Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome ends up being in the top 20. But again, we're not talking about box office killer here. Just a movie that exists and succeeds within its own merits. Even though there's, I think, obvious problems with the film, you still have that production design. You still have that aesthetic. You still have a killer third act. And that's what audiences pay for. And that's, I think, what audiences leave the theater with.
Let's pause here, too, for a moment. I mean, these movies, to a certain extent, built their audiences on video, right?
Yeah.
You know, Mad Max and then Road Warrior, both primed for the VHS boom in America. Huge video rental titles, big deal. But like, I don't know how many people who are like under 30 listening to us, but it's like, remember how small a TV was. It sucked. It was like, take your laptop screen and make it like 1/10 the resolution. It's just like, it looked like garbage. And so, like you say, seeing this movie, seeing like the action in these movies on the big screen was a huge deal. And I think that's part of the success of Thunderdome, right? Is like, I didn't get to see The Road Warrior in the theater. I didn't get to see Mad Max in the theater. I want to but I know what those car chases look like. So I'm going to go see this one.
It sort of lives on, especially as the star of Mel Gibson continues to rise. And I think this is another aspect of Thunderdome that makes that movie a little bit different. There's a lot of dialogue that the Mad Max character has in Beyond Thunderdome. I didn't count the lines. I'm not that sort of cinephile, but it feels like there's more dialogue that Mel Gibson has in the first 15 minutes of Thunderdome than in the prior two films combined, honestly. And you can see that star persona just growing. And it's not cheap to make these movies the way George Miller would go back and make them. But at this point, with your star being increasingly more expensive, you can double that budget overnight every year that Mel Gibson's star power keeps on increasing in the second half of the 80s.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And I mean, that's all, you know, the Mel Gibson is, again, another big part of the reason people go to see Thunderdome. But it's also, you know, he's also part of the reason that movie is very different from The Road Warrior, because he occupies a very different place in Hollywood. Granted, he hasn't been in Lethal Weapon yet, you know.
No, but it's after Lethal Weapon that I think you have to start thinking that there's not going to be another Mad Max movie just because...
Right. Mel Gibson's
getting him back on board. You can't afford Mel Gibson and the stunts. You can't.
Right. Yeah.
He prices himself out. Hollywood prices Mel Gibson out of this franchise. So you lose your leading man, even leading man who doesn't talk that much, just because it was too successful, unfortunately. Yeah. And I think that's why after Thunderdome, even though there might have been a lot of goodwill for there to be another Mad Max movie, there wasn't really a way to see this happening.
Mm.
So as we talk about the road to Fury Road, and I'm going to be bringing a lot of Kyle Buchanan's book, Blood, Sweat, and Chrome, which is an oral history of the making of Mad Max Fury Road here. So anything that I come in, I'm going to attribute directly to that wonderful book. I highly, highly recommend it. But the road to getting to Fury Road was a long one, culminating 30 years later with the release of the film. But at first, the first plans or conversations of bringing back Mad Max, just because of Mel Gibson's star power, had to be without Mel Gibson. You had to recast him. There was no way to afford him and afford this type of movie, especially knowing the box office draw that it had previously, right? They're not these great blockbusters that are going to make that money back.
Right.
So the first ideas of bringing back Mad Max was in the mid-90s when you had shows like Hercules,
Xena,
and Xena, the warrior princess.
Yeah.
You had an idea of like, hey, this isn't really a sequential narrative here. One episode doesn't have to lead to another. What if we just bring Mad Max as a syndicated TV show? You have that aesthetic a little bit in Xena, the warrior princess. Let's make it cheap. Let's make a 22-minute long story every week, different little bits and bobs, and see what happens with it. Maybe we can sell some toys. We don't have to worry about an R rating. There's actually some traction behind that idea, Russ. We weren't very far away from Mad Max being a Xena the Warrior Princess ripoff that we all kind of remember in the 1990s.
Yeah, I'm glad we avoided that.
Yeah, it would have been a very different fate. But as George Miller starts taking the idea more seriously and starts getting a little bit more involved, a sense comes to him very quickly saying, hey, listen, if I'm going to get involved, there's just no way for this to work on a small screen.
Yeah.
For me to go back into this world, I need a real budget. I need real location shooting. I need real stunts. So we go back to the idea of having Mad Max be a cinematic spectacle. At this point, after a number of legal issues, the rights to the Mad Max franchise revert back to its creator, George Miller. Very weird for that to happen. And he shops it around in the 2000s, early 2000s. But as you might remember, the film industry, especially after 9/11, September 2001, there's market contraction there. There's a lot of concerns in terms of the viability of big budget films. There's a little bit of a recession in Hollywood that doesn't get rectified until the release of the first Spider-Man film in May of 2002 that really reestablishes that tentpole model. And in 2002 is exactly the year when 20th Century Fox buys into the idea of bringing Mad Max back and actually brings up enough of a budget to bring back Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson was actually paid and contracted to come back and do these movies at the height of Mel Gibson's stardom at this point. At this point, he's not only an actor, he's an Academy Award-winning director. Nothing can go wrong with Mel Gibson. Ultimately, Mel Gibson signs on and pre-production work begins in 2002 for this, gets pretty far into the process. Storyboards are completed. I mean, detailed storyboards in 2002 of the entirety of Mad Max Fury Road happen. And this is a film that its entire concept basically takes the last 30 minutes of a Mad Max movie and asks, what if the entire movie is the last 30 minutes of a Mad Max movie? No story, no setup, just do the chase. 2 hours of a chase and let's see what happens. But eventually the costs start piling up. It's not cheap making these movies. It's not cheap making them with Mel Gibson in 2002. Fox ends up pulling the plug in development and the movie goes back into the drawer.
Yep. And again, that was the thing where I mentioned earlier where Miller has said, what gets him to do a sequel is the story and the form of the movie. And that form for Fury Road is exactly what you just said. Like, what if the whole movie was just the last 30 minutes of a Mad Max movie? That's exactly it. That's what he's talking about there. He's kind of done that twice, which is why there's two of these movies that are held up as like the canonical greats, right? Where he did that after Mad Max. He was like, well, what if we did Mad Max, but just like got rid of all this stuff that doesn't work? And then you get the Road Warrior. And they kind of backslide a little bit with Thunderdome. And then for Fury Road, obviously takes this, light year leap forward with the creation of this movie. Meanwhile, you've got him nearly doing a Justice League movie you've
Yeah,
got him
that
doing Happy Feet, which
ends
takes
up
a
being a huge
lot of
hit.
time,
Yeah,
takes
a lot of time.
huge amount of time, but is done for Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers releases that movie. It's a giant hit, global hit, Oscar winning.
He goes to Fox for Fury Road, the original 2002 version. That falls apart. Goes back to Warner Brothers, is able to make a hit with Happy Feet. Obviously, this Justice League movie also falls apart, like right at the 1 yard line, right at the goal line. Two huge spectacle movies completely fall apart last minute. That can be extremely demoralizing. And then you get to the question mark of what does George Miller make next? He's got two projects ready to go right in front of him that he can pitch. Happy Feet 2 and Mad Max Fury Road. At this point, Mel Gibson, his star power, let's say, is extremely diminished from back when it was in 2002. That was a very eventful decade for Mel Gibson from 2002 to 2012.
Let's be very clear whose fault that was.
Yes, that you can only look
those
at
were
one
self-inflicted wounds by Mel Gibson
that he's still trying to recover from. You know, he's still an Academy Award nominated director, even after the career downfall that he had. But it no longer became Mel Gibson's too expensive. It's Mel Gibson is radioactive.
Yeah,
totally. There's no way to make this with Mel Gibson.
More radioactive than the water in Thunderdome.
Very much so. So you have to move on from that concept. And for a while, in 2012, it looks like George Miller's going to make it Steven Spielberg style, where he's going to be making two very different movies back to back in the same year, going from Happy Feet 2 to Mad Max Fury Road. And again, I have to remind everyone, Mad Max Fury Road, maybe there's no script, but there are extremely detailed shot-by-shot storyboards ready to go for this movie. It's pretty much 98% there. They had the entire production ready to go a decade prior with Fox. They just ramp it back up again. And the casting process starts. And this is always interesting to me because we talk about the, let's say, negative impact or negative influence of casting Tina Turner as the main antagonist in Beyond Thunderdome. It looks like there weren't enough lessons learned in that by the time we get to 2012, because remember, you have to not only have to recast Max, you also have to cast Furiosa, which it ends up being her movie in many ways. So in the casting of this film, Rihanna is briefly considered. Now, I'm not sure if she's considered for either Furiosa or one of the wives, but I know she is seriously considered in the casting process. And to recast Mad Max, Eminem, fresh out of 8 Mile, Eminem. I'm not sure that would have worked. Ultimately, Eminem, reportedly, according to Kyle Buchanan's oral history of the production here, Eminem just refuses to leave Detroit to go to the desert to shoot this for 3 months. Maybe the right call. I don't think he's the most patient recording artist out there. I don't think that would have worked out very well for anyone on that set, having Eminem in the desert. But they look at other actors at the time. Armie Hammer, Jeremy Renner, both finalists.
Well, Armie Hammer was going to be in Miller's Justice League movie too. So that doesn't come out of nowhere.
No, not out of nowhere. Michael Fassbender, another finalist. Then for a long time before his passing, Heath Ledger was very closely involved, taking meetings, looking at the storyboards to step into that character. Until at the last minute, Tom Hardy, which is coming off of the shooting of The Dark Knight Rises, takes on this movie to take over the Mad Max character. Gal Gadot, who ended up being part of the next iteration of the Justice League for Warner Brothers, ends up being a finalist for the Furiosa role, but that ultimately goes to Charlize Theron. In the world of casting, I think this ended up being pretty good. I think Tom Hardy does a great job here without upstaging anyone, and Charlize steps up to the assignment perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, they work spectacularly well on screen together. You know, I think it's funny that you talk about Eminem not being the most patient actor and what it might have been like to get Eminem, out in the desert for months. It seems like getting Tom Hardy out in the desert for months.
Yeah, didn't work out for too many people.
Didn't work out. So,
yeah, that didn't work out either. Rewind a little bit, because even though the casting was all set up and ready to go in 2012, the movie already falls apart for the second time because I believe it was flooding, or I think it
flooding
was
in Namibia.
Storms in Namibia where it was supposed to be shot.
Like all their locations were washed away, basically.
Shut down The second time they're about to get started on the movie, entire production shuts down. You don't know what's going to happen.
I think they rolled cameras there a little bit, but regardless, yeah, it's really early on in that process. It's
canceled again. And it's interesting because there were plans in the 2012 version of this production of Mad Max Fury Road, which would have looked very similar to what we saw. Of course, you still have Tom Hardy, you still have Charlize Theron. The storyboard is the storyboard. What you see on film is very close to that storyboard. But the main difference here is that George Miller had actually, in those 30 years between Thunderdome and Fury Road, had not only written Fury Road, he had written two separate films, a prequel, Furiosa, and a sequel, or maybe it's another prequel. I don't know if it's a sequel or prequel, Mad Max Wasteland, which is, if there's another Mad Max movie, I would assume that might be it. But Furiosa actually was prepared to get produced as an anime standalone film to lead into the theatrical release of Fury Road. So you would have, in a way, that this is something that Warner Brothers had actually done with the Matrix sequels, if you remember. They had released this Animatrix as a tie-in to the Matrix. And that was what Furiosa, which is about to come out next weekend, as a big, large budget spectacle of 2024, it was originally going to be an anime tie-in for the 2012 version of Fury Road. That production getting shut down saved us from that. It actually gave us a real version of Furiosa that we can enjoy a week from now.
Well, and the Furiosa script, like you say, has been around forever. It's been around so long that scenes from Furiosa were used in auditions for the characters in Fury Road. Like actors who were cast in Fury Road, some of them, their auditions were scenes from that Furiosa script, which is wild, because that's just not the way it's done now. Now we're lucky if they've got a finished concept before the movie goes into production. And, you also have to remember, like, when Fury Road finally did come out, nobody knew what this movie was going to look like. Not a lot of people had confidence. The general
certainly
thing
in the studio.
Was
like, by the time we get
even
the
in
cut
audiences.
of what we saw, nobody knew what to expect here because it was all in George Miller's head. Even in the production of the film, actors were very unhappy during the production. Some of the crew were already questioning what was going on. The issue here, Russ, is that because it had been prepared so exhaustively and storyboarded in such a detailed manner, what George Miller ends up doing is he shoots Fury Road sequential. That means in the order of scenes that the film happens. The only
which is not how movies are shot ever.
No, because it's good for the performance, but it's really difficult on a schedule to do that.
It's highly impractical.
It adds, I think, about a month of production time to making the actual film. But the one exception here, and this will come back to haunt the production of this movie later on, is at the bookends of the film, set in the Citadel, meeting all the Immortan Joe scenes in that clifftop community, and then going back to that clifftop community in the end. That was supposed to shoot, I believe, in South Africa at the end of that 2013, 2014 production of Mad Max Fury Road. So they shot everything sequentially in the desert in Namibia, a long, arduous process. Some of the shots would be 2 to 3 seconds long. So the actors were unhappy with the process. They were uncomfortable. The crew didn't really know what was going on. The studio would get dailies and be like, hey, what's going on? Why are we sending you hundreds of millions of dollars to send these people in Africa to shoot this movie? There was a lot of, let's say, second guessing during the production of this movie, just by the way it was produced.
And also think about this, like the story out in public of Fury Road after the movie was released is like, this movie is all practical. Because yes, they did a lot of stuff practically. Like those cars existed, they crashed, there's incredible stunts in the movie. A lot of that stuff, yes, was done for real. But George Miller has also been very forthcoming. I think he's said there's something like every single shot in Fury Road has CG. There's shots of like Tom Hardy's Max sitting in the cab of the war rig. And if they didn't think that like his arm was in the right place, they would use CG to move it.
Yeah.
Like every single shot in that movie has CG. So when you talk about taking that footage and sending it to a studio and being like, well, here's what we've got. And I mean, I think if you look at that stuff raw, a lot of it doesn't look great, you know,
It
because
was
like
alarming. It was alarming for
the
the
sky
studio.
is
Yeah.
totally flat and washed out. And Miller, of course, in his head, he's like, oh yeah, I'm just going to digitally put a sky there. You know,
Yeah.
you got to remember, this is after 2 fully CG Happy Feet movies.
Mhm.
Miller, who is like begins his career as the most practical of film directors, is now so comfortable with CG, has no problem with using it, is in fact eager to use it to make this movie look like what's in his head. And so he's like, oh yeah, no, none of that matters because we're going to change that all anyway.
You're going to have to take his word for it, right? It
But-
doesn't matter that the shot is 3 seconds long. That's the shot
Right.
I need. You have to take his word for it. And I think naturally, when you talk about a movie at this scale with this budget, shooting for months on end in Africa, there's going to be hard questions. Warner
Yeah.
Brothers gets so concerned that studio head Jeff Robinoff actually flies to Africa himself to figure out what the heck is going on here. Now, in the background of all of this happening, Russ, it's important to say at this point, Warner Brothers is in a major transition. The
Mhm.
Nolan Batman movies are done. The Harry Potter movies are done. Before this point,
Lord of the
when
Rings
Fury
movies were
Lord of the Rings movies done, kind
done.
of. We'd have another trilogy, but let's
Yeah.
save that for later. At this point, the major IPs from Warner Brothers that had made it the #1 studio when Mad Max Fury Road is greenlit, they're finished with their runs. And we are in a situation where there is a new grab for power to head up the studio. And Jeff Robinoff, the sitting studio head, now has to fight for his job and needs to make sure that everything getting made under his watch is going to make money. And the one big flashing red warning sign that you've got there is currently sinking $100 million plus into
the
things
desert.
that do not look great from what you're getting in terms of footage. Of course, he flies to Namibia to see what's going on. And this is where the story can go off the rails. Robinov, according to Kyle Buchanan's oral history, stops production.
Yeah.
Stops production, tells George Miller and his crew, I know you're supposed to shoot the beginning and the ending of your movie in South Africa, all these Citadel scenes. I know you have extras. I know you have a separate crew waiting for you there. I know you have the set built. I'm not going to give you the money to do it. This movie has to go without a beginning and without an ending. And the narrative structure of Mad Max Fury Road, to remind everyone, is a movie that is 100% a chase movie. And what you need in a chase movie
for the beginning
is
and
a
the
beginning
ending.
and an end, right? Otherwise, you just have people driving with no destination. And when the beginning and the end is the exact same destination, and you pull that from production, to put it bluntly, you're screwed. And at this point, they had 80% of a movie that 0% worked without the remaining 20%. That 10% at the beginning, that 10% at the end was missing. Unless you found money somewhere for a reshoot, it was just going to be a disaster all around.
And this, by the way, that visit and that decision and that shutdown were extensively reported in the trades at the time, which contributed significantly to what I was saying earlier about the fact that nobody knew, down to audiences, nobody knew what this movie was going to look like. And everybody was kind of worried that it was a total boondoggle. And that in part is due to that reporting. You know, because of course, nobody had seen the stuff that Miller had in his head or had seen what he had put on camera. I think at that point, there were like some shots of some of the cars out there. So you knew he had built cars. And that was about, as an onlooker, that was kind of all you had.
Now, that Robinov visit ended up being fateful for the film. You've got George Miller coming back with 80% of a movie. Without a beginning, without an end, the movie just doesn't work. There's a lot of hard questions being asked on the gamble that Warner Brothers took in making Mad Max Fury Road. But something pivotal happens here. Robinov doesn't end up getting the top job at Warner Brothers. It ends up going to Kevin Sujihara, who is now in charge of introducing new franchises, rebuilding the studio, rebuilding those IPs. He takes one look at Fury Road and goes, hey, how come this movie doesn't have a beginning? And how come this movie doesn't have an ending? What if I give you the money to shoot them?
Sujihara, who, by the way, is a theme parks guy.
Yeah.
You know, so it makes a lot of sense that a theme parks guy looks at a theme
a
park
roller
ride,
coaster,
a
basically,
roller
and
coaster
says,
ride
"Hey,
of a movie, and is like,
you need to
yes,
start
let's do
somewhere and
this
end in the
movie."
same place."
Exactly.
Absolutely. And that's what we end up having. Sujihara comes in, gives the production enough money to go back and shoot those Citadel sequences. And then we get into the give and take battle of we've got hours upon hours upon hours of footage of what seems to be 10 minutes of plot at the beginning, 10 minutes of narrative resolution at the end. And then we got like 3 hours of a chase in the middle. What are we going to do with this? The studio was divided into two camps. One of them backing George Miller's cut, which was less dialogue driven, a lot more action oriented. And one camp of the studio wanting it to be a little bit more marketable. Not so much footage of the War Boys, of Immortan Joe. They were scary. You wanted more hot people in the movie. You know, Charlize Theron, Tom Hardy, the wives.
The wives.
Don't give me those
yeah.
ugly people. Just give me the hot people. No
Yeah.
scary things. And can you make it PG-13? Can we make this maybe closer to 90 minutes, PG-13? Miller's not having it. Ultimately, I think I read there ended up being 14 different cuts of Mad Max Fury Road, all of them significantly different to one another, ending up getting tested in test screenings before the release until finally it comes down to one fateful test screening on the same night where you had a studio PG-13 cut and George Miller's R-rated cut screening simultaneously in parallel theaters, and hands down, the George Miller cut ended up winning out.
Played.
And that's what we ended up getting. We ended up getting, I think, for my money, and I don't think I'm resigned to say this because I hopefully live a long life of movie going. I don't think I'll see a better studio picture in my lifetime. You have something that looks like nothing else ever made at this scale, and it nearly by a hair didn't happen.
By so many hairs. It nearly didn't happen so many times. Two things I want to say here, or two things I want to add here. Number one, with respect to editing, George Miller's spouse, George Miller's wife, is a woman named Margaret Sixel, who is a highly accomplished film editor. She was the primary driver behind the editing. She's the editor of Fury Road. She's the architect of that movie as much as George Miller is. She won every award there is to win for her work on Fury Road, which is just wonderful in the wake of that, doubt and fear on the part of the studio where they're like, maybe we don't do it this way. Because I think if you look at Fury Road as an example of anything right now, one of the top things that you see is an absolute masterwork of film editing.
Yeah, this is as much her achievement as it is George Miller's. It has to be
unquestionably.
Yeah,
unquestionably. She is as much the author of this movie as George Miller is. Her work is exceptional on this film. She's a great editor, and she just blows this out of the water. That said, well, not that said. To enable that, George Miller did something that was very controversial with the crew, and which was, I think, part of the reason that some of the crew didn't have a lot of confidence in Fury Road on the day, hearkening back to his early days shooting Mad Max. And John Seale talks about this in various places where George Miller's edict was put the dot on the forehead, which is to say, in the viewfinder of the camera, there's a little dot in the center showing you the center of the frame. And Miller wanted that dot between the eyes of an actor always, like, period. And they had so many camera people working on this movie because they ran sometimes like dozens of cameras simultaneously. They put little digital Canon, SLRs on cars because it was like, oh yeah, we can crash them and who cares, But you're talking about having these hours and hours and hours of footage to comb through. And one thing that I think Miller was frankly nearly genius for doing is creating this edict of center framing an actor all the time, because what it means is that you can cut between any of it. It all matches. Yeah. Because like you've got, shots of Charlize Theron in the war rig that were maybe shot months apart in widely different conditions. But because of the way that Miller was like, this is how you frame it, it all cuts. And so I think that that's an essential part of the engineering of Fury Road, as it were, is to do this kind of unconventional approach to cinematography and to framing, which a lot of people on the crew didn't understand and didn't like. And again, Miller is like, please just listen to me. Like, I've got a plan. I know what I'm doing here. I have a plan. There's a reason. And then you see the movie and it's like, oh, well, yeah, that works really, really well.
And it's a fantastic achievement here. I also want to single out the film score, that for the first time, I think we have a score in a Mad Max movie that can live up to the action set pieces. From Junkie XL, it is relentless. It is paced perfectly. I think this is a situation where the sound mix also works really, really well. The dialogue is just barely audible. The score ramps up when you need it to. You hear the environment, the cars. I saw this in, I think it was my first time at a Dolby Cinema auditorium. So that was, I'm pretty sure it's an Atmos sound mix that I got to experience, but it was incredible listening to this movie. Actually, in the rewatch of these movies as I prepared for this podcast, Russ, what I ended up doing is I ended up setting up my 4K Blu-ray player with headphones that are Atmos enabled. So I was able to just listen to it for the first time. Because I've seen the movie countless times, but I never sat down and just heard Fury Road. And the sound in this movie is incredible. What sets it apart. It really is a fantastic, fantastic sound mix, and a great job on the score here from Junkie XL that pushes and ties the film together. Imagine watching this without a score or even a temp score. No wonder that those Warner executives were looking at this footage going, what the hell's going on here? It was a movie that I think was hard to make, expensive to make, and then hard to market. Because after all of these things that we say, we have essentially a very expensive movie about Mad Max hero that has been recast into a nearly mute character. Tom Hardy's wearing a metal mask on his face for the first 40 minutes of the movie. The entire movie is a relentless chase sequence. The first 3 reels of the movie, the first half hour, is just a chase. How are you going to market this movie with barely any dialogue? And then under that, is it an action movie? Is it not? There's a very strong feminist thread in this film and a huge environmentalist thread in this movie. So you have this feminist environmental franchise movie that recasts its star that you're trying to sell to mass audiences. It was always going to be a huge bet for the studio. Fortunately, they had the right cut of the film to go out, but ultimately it doesn't really break out at the box office the way I think a lot of us remember it breaking out. It's something that you always remind me of, Russ. You might have these great memories of Fury Road. It actually didn't do that great in the market. It was a great movie, but it didn't find the audience maybe it should have.
You know, like I said it before, it's a weird movie. It's it is very evidently a weird movie. And people, by and large, you know, that 4-quadrant audience you need for $100 million weekend, they don't like a weird movie. They want a familiar movie. They want entertainment, which Fury Road absolutely provides. I think they want more comfort than this movie provides. And you can tell just looking at a trailer, it's like, what is this? And to us, to a certain audience, that's the magic of it. But it was never destined, unfortunately, to do the numbers that you would like to see it do. Because you watch this movie, and I think anybody who watches even a fair number of movies could watch Fury Road and think, I've never seen anything like this. I don't know when I'm going to see an action movie that matches this achievement. This is a singular experience. And that's wonderful, but unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily translate into the kind of success financially that you think it deserves.
And of course, as moviegoers, I don't care. I stress this all the time. I do not care. Russ and I work for this company, and we're happy to work with this company. As filmgoers, we do not care how much money these movies make. As long as the movie is good, that's all I go into it. Now, we have a professional responsibility to talk about movies in this way, so we do have to bring that up. And doing a market analysis of this film, it ends up opening in second place, sandwiched between the opening weekend of Pitch Perfect 2, which takes over that female demo and just kills it with a $69 million opening weekend. Mad Max Fury Road opens in second place with 45, so quite a bit away from that Pitch Perfect 2 demo, which, like I said, takes that female demo in your feminist narrative, that's out the window. And then on the action movie narrative, right behind Fury Road in third place is the third weekend of Avengers Age of Ultron. Of course, the Marvel movie that looks like every other Marvel movie and is very familiarly comfortable.
I really wonder, this was also prior to the dominance of premium large format.
Yes. And I mentioned this movie in that Dolby Cinema experience. It was my first Dolby Cinema experience. This is right as it might have been, if not the first, maybe the second or third release in that format after AMC signed the Dolby exclusivity in its circuit. You had IMAX. And that was basically, I mean, of course, you had, immersive seating. Those didn't have the footprint they have today, right?
And the marketing of those was not the same, you know?
No, not at all. Not at all. Very, very different time there. And that's why I count Fury Road as maybe the best movie-going experience of my lifetime, because I didn't know what I was going into, and I had never been to a Dolby Cinema auditorium before. It was my first time actually seeing this technology. I'd done the demos like everyone else at CinemaCon. I'd never seen it in action.
Well, let me tell you, I mean, like me seeing Fury Road for the first time is one of the best cinematic experiences I've had, not just for the movie, but because I went to the first press screening in Los Angeles. The first time they showed this movie to press in Los Angeles was with an opening conversation with George Miller, who is being interviewed by Edgar Wright. And then after the movie, a cocktail thing with George Miller. So I watched Fury Road, and then I spent 2 hours talking to George Miller, just like when listening to him talk to other people.
Yeah.
And like, you've never seen a dude.
That's wonderful.
You've never seen a guy bask in relief and happiness the way George Miller was that night when he's just shown this movie that's taken so much of his life to create, and he's shown it to people and he's blown their damn faces off with it. You know, and you watch George Miller just walking around in like this happy daze. It was wonderful. But what theater do you think that would be at? It was at the Landmark.
No, really?
A nice theater.
But not the sort of venue you would think. I would think maybe the Chinese Man Theater, maybe the Cinerama Dome, something like that.
Or
even
at the
Landmark.
Or even the IMAX at City Walk or something like that.
Yeah, that's something that you would think that would take place.
And so anyway, I say that just by way of like, again, this was not a knock against the Landmark. I like that theater.
No, it's a
very
great
much.
theater. I love it. I've been to it many times, but you just wouldn't associate an event like this with that.
This event movie with that theater, like it's not, a technically forward theater, or it wasn't. The theater is now closed. But anyway, that's the point, is that like this was pre-PLF as like the be all end all of how you presented this kind of movie, right? Now, I will say the first time I saw footage from Fury Road was at Comic-Con, and I have
that was the coming out party. You were at that Comic-Con presentation. I was going to ask you, because that's when people start talking about this.
Well, it's the first time anybody saw footage.
Yeah.
Nobody had seen anything from Fury Road. Nobody knew what the movie was going to look like. Nobody had seen anything. And I have very few really happy Comic-Con memories, right? Specifically Hull H Comic-Con memories. By and large, I'm happy to forget most of it. And it was one of the first times they did this thing where like Hull H is cavernous, and they just had screens, like it was almost like a ScreenX thing, right? And they have a little screen at the center, and then it all just opens up to like cover the entire walls of the thing. And they played a big chunk of that first act chase scene.
Wow.
And you just experiencing a room saying holy shit to themselves every 3 seconds for however long that footage ran. And I mean, it's one of the most, it was crazy to be in that room and see that stuff, just to feel the reaction of people around who were very clearly bowled over by it. And either one end of the spectrum didn't know this movie existed 10 minutes ago, and at the other end of the spectrum had been following the reporting on it for years and had come to the conclusion that it was probably going to be terrible and a disaster. And so that's kind of the spectrum of people you're dealing with. And everybody sees that Fury Road footage. It's like, oh my God.
Well, that launched the movie, that Comic-Con presentation. I mean, I avoid Comic-Con with every fiber of my being. I was paying attention.
Yeah.
It's one of those moments in that event's history that really puts a film on the map and directs attention to it. And the film performed, as we mentioned, well. I mean, it ends up being, I think, one of the top 20, top 25 movies of 2015. It's not a huge hit, but it ends up, I think, in every major publications top 10 list movies, not only of the year, but of the decade. It's certainly in mine. And I'm trying to think back on, like, what was the disconnect there, when it was originally released? Why didn't the audiences find it and embrace it? Why is a lot of this appreciation months after the fact? But also the fact that both the feminist and environmental themes in this movie don't pat themselves in the back and remind you they are feminist or environmental themes. They are part of the narrative as a whole. You don't have the female Avengers assemble self-congratulatory shot that you see in, what was it? I think Infinity War, that you just kind of like groan through, right? That's not a teenager lecturing you about fossil fuels and its environmental themes. No, it's a movie that presents ideas to you. You can take them or leave them, and is able to treat you as an adult in presenting these themes. And I think that is something that stands to the film's benefit. It ends up staying in my mind, and these themes end up resonating more and more, I think, obviously, by what happened culturally in the US in the months and years afterwards, and especially how some movies with a quote unquote social message, I think, mishandled those aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been a consistent driver of the popularity of the Mad Max movies since day one. The post-apocalyptic theme for the original movie is pretty negligible, and it's mostly because they didn't have the money to do anything real. Miller kind of like set it in the future, like a near future, just to kind of give him himself an excuse to get away with some stuff. But it's not until The Road Warrior that they have the money to kind of like make it look like a real post-apocalyptic thing or whatever. But, that movie is being like, the original Mad Max is released against the backdrop of, gasoline crisis that happened globally, where, there's OPEC embargo, there's gasoline shortages. Miller's talked about part of the origin of the scenario for Mad Max coming out of, seeing people's behavior when they're waiting in line trying to get gas, in Australia in, the couple of years prior to the movie. And then you've got, the Cold War driving stuff behind The Road Warrior and Thunderdome. Like, these movies have all come out at moments of sort of a social political crisis or big tension point. And even when they haven't explicitly made themselves about that thing, they still clearly draw on it. And I think that is, like you say, I think that's part of why these movies resonate maybe more in the months and years after their release than they do in the moment, because it's a thing that when somebody sees one of these movies for the first time, even if it's a couple of years later, it's not just, oh, wow, this is a great action movie, which it by and large probably is. It's that, oh, this also kind of taps into other things that I'm feeling that don't have as much, that are maybe kind of on screen, but that's not the main thing that's going on screen, right? But they're
politically conscious, not politically driven. And that's a crucial distinction. Yes. There are clear, and I'd say even explicit, political elements in all of these films, maybe Fury Road more than any other, but it's not driven, and it doesn't congratulate itself for its politics.
Right. There's no illusions that these movies are solving anything.
Exactly. It's not contributing to improving the world. It's an action movie, but it's an action movie with an opinion, and it's an action movie with a viewpoint. I value that perspective, and I value that self-awareness in coming in with that specific perspective into a huge blockbuster. It's really hard to pull off.
Yeah.
I think these movies all pull that off, and Fury Road, being probably the most politically conscious out of all of them, pulls it off perfectly. Where it's, to this day, I think we all talk about those elements in the movie, but it's not the first thing we all talk about. It's still in the conversation, but it doesn't drive the conversation or take over the conversation when you talk about Fury Road.
Right.
And that's why I think it's more effective than any of the other movies that came out in the wake of that 2015-2016 election cycle in the US.
It's not like Fury Road is a subtle movie.
No,
You
it's
know,
obvious.
None
in
of
every,
this,
in
none of
every
this
way it
stuff
can.
is like, but it's not preachy.
That's what I mean. It's not a
yeah.
teenager lecturing you about fossil fuels.
Yeah.
That's not how you effectively bring up arguments or bring up a conversation, especially
Right.
not in a medium like cinema, in a popular medium like cinema.
Right.
It's a movie that deals with its feminist themes and its environmental themes in a way that a general audience can engage with as much as they'd like. If you want to
Yeah.
leave it behind, you can enjoy the movie without taking it.
Yeah.
But if you want to dive a little bit deeper, there's a lot in that well. And it ends up being a really good conversation if you want to go down that road.
I agree.
Well, Russ, thank you so much for all your time in helping me go over the entire cultural, economic, and film history of the Mad Max franchise. Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga from director George Miller and studio Warner Brothers, comes out to a theater near you starting next weekend. And that was Russ Fischer, the editorial director from the Box Office Studios, joining us here on the Box Office Podcast to talk everything Mad Max. Earlier, you heard from Romeo Duchene from the Box Office Networks going over the latest forecasting updates that we have here on boxofficepro.com. Don't forget to subscribe if you like what we're doing here on the Box Office Podcast. New episodes come out every Thursday, and we'll talk to you again next week.